Conversation. I am your host and founder of the Money Conversation, Andre Gordon. And you're probably wondering, in terms of the title, the Money Conversation, what does that mean? Well, I've been in financial services well over a decade. And in talking around or about money, it still becomes one of those taboo subjects that a lot of people feel uncomfortable talking about. Religion, politics, even down to sexual orientation are areas that people feel more comfortable talking about than they do with money. And the goal of this podcast is to try to normalize our conversations around money so that we become much more familiar with it, much more comfortable with it, and having these type of conversations around financial topics and money as normal as we have around weather, politics, sports, or even TV show recaps. And so today, I wanted to kick things off in the month of October. Many of you may not know that the month of October is a state planning month. And before the month of October closes out, this is an important conversation that we should be having around financial topics. And it often gets overlooked because it's not as sexy as building financial portfolios or talking about investments. But even though it's not as sexy and exciting, it is still one of the critical elements to wealth generation, wealth building, and certainly wealth transference. So today, my first guest on the Money Conversation podcast is Meredith Hill, the owner of Meredith Hill Law out of Washington, D.C. Please welcome Meredith.
Hello.
Welcome, Meredith. We are very glad to have you on the inaugural episode of the Money Conversation. How are you this evening?
Good. I'm excited to be here. I feel so special that I'm the first guest.
Well, excellent. I appreciate you taking your time and giving us a snapshot of some of your expertise.
Mm-hmm.
What I thought we would do to kick things off, if you can give everyone a synopsis of kind of who you are, your background and your practice, that way they can get an understanding of your expertise as we move forward throughout the evening.
Okay. So my name is Meredith. I live in Maryland. My practice is based in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is right outside of Washington, D.C. I founded my practice about how long has it been? 2 years ago, but I've been practicing law for about 10 years. My business focuses on estate planning as well as helping small businesses. I like to help individuals and businesses secure and protect what matters to them most. So in terms of estate planning, I will dive into the estate planning, what I'm protecting on that. But so that's what I do right now. I'm licensed in Maryland as well as the District of Columbia. So any state-specific questions, I'm not going to be able to really assist, but I can give general answers and assist that way.
Okay, perfect. Now, why was estate planning an area of focus for you? What made you want to get into that and be able to focus your practice around that?
Well, that's a good question. So like many other people, I didn't know much about estate planning, and I just thought it was for old rich people. And because for some reason, when you hear the word estate, people think of real estate and you think of like big mansions. And I just think about the show Dallas or something, even though it be before my time, but still, that's what I think about. And then I would always, when anybody died or passed away in the family, all I would see would just be like contentious behavior between family members and friends, a lot of fighting. And I just thought that was normal. So one day I volunteered at a church in Baltimore to do a simple estate plans for seniors in the community who were low income, who really wanted their basic documents drafted by an attorney. And it wasn't until then when I started drafting those documents for them that I really started to see like, hey, this makes sense to have a plan about what's going to happen to your stuff and your belongings when you pass away. And not just that, like what's going to happen to you if you're ever in a position where you can't communicate on behalf of yourself. And so to me, it just like clicked at that moment, like we need to do more of this, uh,
Mm-hmm.
especially in our community. It's just not really talked about. And so I decided to focus my practice on, or part of my practice on estate planning and just getting the word and education out there about that.
Okay. Now, let me ask you this question before we get into some of the other questions. Your reality of exactly what you uncovered when you actually started doing estate planning, especially within our community, versus what you may have thought it was before you actually got involved. How much different was that once you got your kind of boots on the ground and started working within our community and having conversations? How much of a dire need did you realize it was versus what you thought it may have been?
There's a dire need. um, so what I saw a lot about in our community is just a general lack of knowledge and a general misunderstanding and misperception of what estate planning is, and a lack of trust about the process. One thing that I got a lot was people saying, well, isn't the government just going to take all my stuff? And I'm like, that's not exactly correct. Let's talk about this and walk through some things. And so the more I educated people about it, the more they're like, oh, yeah, this is really important. And likewise, as the more I educated myself about it and the more I practiced it, the more I saw how much our counterparts were doing this and had been doing this for ever. And that is how they have been able to build generational wealth. They didn't just get rich overnight. This has been systematic and a plan. And that is what estate planning is all about, is having a plan and taking control of your process, your property, your assets, and everything that you've worked so hard to accomplish and build up over your lifetime. You don't want that just to like go willy-nilly. You want that to be able to be passed down from generation to generation. So that's something that I saw over and over again when I've been doing this.
Okay. Well, perfect. I think that is a perfect segue into us to start to have this discussion this evening. And I think we're going to hit on a lot of topics that either people have questions about, have misconceptions, or there are myths out there regarding estate planning. And so I think that there's some value-added pieces that we're going to be able to discuss this evening. So you've kind of given a synopsis of it, but in terms of your perspective, how would you describe what is estate planning?
Mm-hmm. So I think at first you have to break it down to like, what is an estate? Because like I said, when I first thought about estate planning, I thought about like having a big mansion, and I don't have a mansion. One day I claim it, I will. But an estate is like all of your property that you own. So that can be your clothes, your jewelry, your cars, your bank accounts, retirement accounts, any financial investments, furniture, all of your like your physical possessions is part of your estate. And so people have a lot more than they realize. So we can touch on that in a little bit. But that's your estate. And once you pass away, you can't take any of that stuff with you, and it's left here behind for people to figure out what's going to happen. And look, if you have an estate plan, you have already written a plan of what you want to do with your estate. And so you are still in control of your estate, even though you are no longer physically on this earth. So that's the most basic understanding of an estate plan. A lot of times people only think of estate plan in the terms of having a will. But it's also, as I mentioned earlier, about having a plan about yourself and your
Mhm.
physical care if there comes a time when you are physically or mentally unable to make decisions for yourself and or communicate those decisions to somebody else.
Okay. Now, in terms of that piece,
Mm.
and I know you and I had a discussion about that earlier, given the current situation with the pandemic and a lot of potential ramifications of getting COVID-19, but one of those issues is in terms of you having to be hospitalized
Mhm.
and maybe being in a situation where you can't speak for yourself to be able to make any medical decisions or at least confer and communicate with the medical personnel. In that capacity, is that where you're talking about being able to have those pieces in place to be able to adjudicate what that needs to be?
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. That's a great example, is what we're going through now with COVID. So in that concept, what I'm referring to is called an advance directive, or it's also called a living will. This is a document that allows you to make decisions about your healthcare, and communicate those decisions about your healthcare and how you want to be treated if there comes a time when you are physically or mentally unable to communicate those decisions to a doctor.
Okay.
I think this is one of the most important, and we'll address all the main documents that I think are very important, but I think this is one of the most important documents that a person should have, because you never know when the unexpected will happen, and you might end up in the hospital tonight and in a coma, and you won't be able to talk to your doctors about your care. And so it'll be left up to your loved ones, like your spouse, your nieces, your nephews, your sons, your daughters, to try to figure out, like, what exactly do you want?
Mhm.
Um, do you want to be put on life support? If you're put on life support, how long do you want to be put on life support? Um, what type of treatment do you want when you're in the hospital? What hospital do you want to go to? All of these things are important and make it easier for the people that are like left behind, because it's
Mhm.
already a stressful situation. Like, if I were to get COVID and end up in the hospital in a coma on a breathing machine, the last thing I would want would be my husband to try to figure out how long to keep me on a breathing machine. No, I just like the thought of that, just like, it makes me shudder. I don't want to put that burden on him. So I'd much
Right.
rather just to have a plan up front and tell them, and tell the doctors. Also, like, when it comes to like an advanced directive, is like people can have, and why it's important, people that are left behind and to make these decisions can be, making selfish decisions, because they don't want you to leave this earth. Um, so I always use the example of my mother. I did her estate plan and we did her advance directive, and I didn't know that she never wants to be put on, life support, or if she's put in a coma, just let her go. She doesn't want anything.
Mhm.
I would have been the selfish one and been like, no, just plug her up forever. I just want to keep her. And meanwhile, she's like, please let me go meet my Lord. It just
Yeah.
is so,
Yeah.
it's so much better. Like, now that I know, and God forbid that happens, I will know, like, okay, this is what my mother wants. She's at peace with this decision.
Yes. No, I think, Meredith, that's an excellent point in terms of being able to set up a plan and having that plan be executed. Because, as you mentioned, at a most stressful time, that's probably not the best time to be making life decisions
Mm-mm.
because you're not thinking about it rationally, you're thinking about it emotionally. And oftentimes, not only in that situation, but there may be contentious decisions that need to be made amongst family members that don't always agree, and it could become a family tug of war around what needs to happen with that loved one. And so if you have a plan, the only thing that everyone has to do is follow the instructions of the plan, and there's no vagueness that is associated with that.
Yes, that is very important. Just have a plan, because like the contentious stuff happens all the time.
All the time.
All the time. And so it's just
Yes.
so much to just have a plan.
Perfect. Okay, so we talked a little bit about advance directives. So let's move now to a situation where I know this probably comes up quite a bit, is if someone were to unexpectedly pass away and they did not have a will, what happens?
Okay. Yes, this is a very common question. So dying without a will is called dying intestate. And so that means that there is a set of laws called the intestacy laws in every single state that governs what happens to your property.
Okay.
So it doesn't mean that if you die without a will, the governor is going to come in and take all your property, sell it, and keep the money. That's not. I don't know the intestacy laws of every state, but at least not here in Maryland.
Right.
So what happens is it would have to go through probate, and we can touch on that. So that's the process going to like opening up the court case of probating your will and dividing up your property. And a lot of times people are like, okay, well, if the state has a plan, that's fine. And I just let the state decide on what's going to happen to my property. But people don't know what these laws are. So a lot of times I'll get single people who are like 28, 29, unmarried, don't have kids. And at least in the state of Maryland, I can only talk about Maryland right now. If you die without a will, part of your property, let's say that you do have a spouse. So part of your property would go to your spouse, and the other part of your property would go to your parents if they're still alive. Okay. So in my situation, it's just me and my husband, and we don't have any kids. And so all of my property, I would ideally want all of my property to go to him and not to my parents. And so a lot of times when I tell people about that, they're like, oh no, I don't want my parents to have all of that. Or I want certain items to go to different family members or to different friends or different nonprofits. A lot of people don't think that they can donate their estate to nonprofits, but they can. And having a plan allows you to take control over what happens. Not having a plan is just allowing the state to have control over your property and what happens after you pass.
Okay. And in terms of the state, like you said, every state has different laws in terms of how that is executed. What in the situation where in Maryland, if say your parents weren't alive and it didn't go to your husband, do they go down the list of next of kin? What's the process that if the first choice of family member is not there, what then happens? Or do they go in a completely different direction?
So usually it's like next of kin, but I don't want to say that as a blanket way because these laws are very complex. Okay. And so if my parents were not alive and my husband and I was single, I'm going to be honest, I would have to check to see, because in the realm that I work in is try to avoid that at all costs.
Right.
I would have to go and see exactly what does Maryland say, like who's going to get it. Will it be my sister? Will it be my uncle? Like, who is it? And you want to be able to have control, so you're not sitting there like, who's going to take my stuff? And you have to keep in mind, like when you pass away and people are cleaning out your house, they're going through all of your stuff. And do you really want your cousin, your uncle going through your dresser drawers and finding Lord knows what. So you just keep that in mind when you are thinking about what you want, whether or not you want to have a will. So yeah, so I always like I had my intern over the summer write her will, and she was like, I don't have anything, I'm only 23, like and I was like, you have more than you think you do. So we started going through stuff, and she was like, oh my gosh, I have these journals that I've been writing in that are like my diaries, and I do not want my parents to see them. I don't want anybody to see them. The only person I can trust is my sister, and I want her to take them and burn them. And she's the only person I would trust to do that. And so we put that in there. That way her sister knows to just take the journals and burn them, instead of having mom and dad go through them and find out things that they probably don't want to know.
Right. That's a very good point, that sometimes people think of an estate plan as monetary, but there's a lot of sentimental value that goes along with that, that is important to people, that they want to make sure it goes to the right person, because of those type of issues that can come up.
Exactly.
Yeah, good points. Good points. All right. So in terms of an estate plan, and we know that they can become very complex, but in terms of just the basics of an estate plan, what do you suggest that everyone should have as far as the basics of an estate plan?
So I always recommend like 3 baseline documents that everybody should have if you're over the age of 18. So the first one is a last will and testament. And that's what we've been discussing a lot about this evening. And that's obviously the document that controls what happens to your physical property once you pass away. You can also make provisions in your will about any funeral arrangements that you wish to have. If you want to be buried or cremated, or you want your gravesite to be, if you want your ashes spread, you can put that in there if you so desire. A will also allows you to make provisions for guardianship of your children if you were to pass away and they were still minors. So this is super important for people who have children who are under the age of 18, because again, we don't know what can happen. So you don't want your children to be left alone, and then the courts are in charge of finding their next guardian. And so your children have already lost a parent or 2 parents, and then they're going through all these court processes, and they might end up with a relative they don't want to end up with. They might end up in foster care, making it so much worse. So I always recommend people that have children get a will. And if you don't put anything else in it, just make provisions for your children. Super duper important. The next document that is important is a financial power of attorney. This document allows you to select someone to step into your shoes and make decisions on your behalf or sign on your behalf if you are physically or mentally unable to do so. So a lot of times people think about power of attorneys of when the mental incapacity is in effect. So like when dementia sets in and people can't really manage their checking account, or they can't really sign their mortgage check, that's when you would implement your power of attorney and they would sign on their behalf. But it's also, like I said, for physical, if you're physically unable to be present to handle the signing of a document, for example. So I always give the example of when my husband and I bought our home. We bought it from an older lady, and she moved out to a retirement community not too far away from here, actually. And at the closing of our house, like, she didn't want to be bothered to show up or sign any of the documents, so she didn't. And so she just sent her power of attorney instead. And her power of attorney signed all the documents for her and allowed us to buy the house. And so she was perfectly healthy and fine, sitting probably 5 miles up the road. She just wanted to watch The Price is Right that day instead of go down to the lender's office and close the deal. And so it just makes it so much easier. Like if you're traveling out of the country and something needs to be signed really quick back at home or anything like that,
Yeah.
you don't have to like worry about interrupting your vacation. You can just call up a friend and say, or call up your power of attorney and say, hey, can you do this for me? What I advise every one of my clients and everyone that I talk to is that really choose a person that you trust to
Mhm.
be your power of attorney, because you are really giving them a lot of power and allowing them to step into your shoes and be you. And the last thing you want to do is show up to the bank one day to withdraw some money and they tell you, hey, you only have $20 in your bank account. And it's because your power of attorney said that you gave them permission. In that same note, talking about banks are really strict about power of attorneys. And a lot of times people think like, oh yeah, I got a power of attorney back in 1998. I don't need to do it again. But for banks, like 1998 was a really, really long time ago, and they want to have current updated forms like every like 2 to 3 years, just to make sure that that fraud doesn't happen. So if you
Right.
have a power of attorney drafted a while ago, I would say more than like 3 years ago, you should get it redrafted. Um, just in case it needs to be used at a financial institution, because they are very strict. And the third document is the advance directive, also known as a living will. And
Okay.
that's what we talked about before. And that's making medical decisions about you if you are physically or mentally unable to make those decisions on your own.
Okay. Those are some really good basics. One of the questions I wanted to follow up on, because this has come up in numerous discussions that I've had with clients, and it's around the care of the small children, the children that are under 18.
Mhm.
And there's the care and welfare that you may want from the person that you trust, but that may not be the same person that you want to handle the financial affairs of your children, especially if there's life insurance or other assets that you will unleash to your children. Is there any direction or guidance that you typically give your clients? Do you have those individuals be separate individuals, that someone else controls the finances for children that are minors,
Mhm.
where someone else may be physically taking care of them? Or do you see them the majority of the time being the same person?
Mhm. So you can name a guardian of the property and guardian of the person. So typically it's the same person. Um, I would recommend the same person unless it is
Okay.
a situation where you're like, okay, this person's a really good caretaker, but they're really not good with money, or I wouldn't trust them. But now that I say that out loud, if you can't trust them with your money, why would you trust them with your child? So if that's the person you're thinking about, I would ask you to really strongly reconsider that decision, because maybe that might not be the best person. But it just makes it a lot easier if it is the same person,
The same person.
so that like there's no back and forth, there's no lag time to try to get permission from the guardian of the property to do something with money. You don't want that. I recommend just really, again, think about it as the same person you would choose for your power of attorney. It does not have to be the same person, but like
Right.
the huge responsibility of giving someone the ability to care for your child if you're no longer here. Um, so yes, it can be two different people, but I would recommend just choosing one.
Choosing one. Okay. And then you mentioned, in terms of obviously financial institutions being very strict around documents and the dates of documents, how often do you recommend people not only once they set up their estate plan, but then review it to make any changes? What do you typically recommend in terms of a time frame for a review?
Mhm. So I recommend at least once a year, because a lot can happen in a year, as we see right now. We're in COVID, and a year ago I had no idea what COVID was. I'm sure a lot of us.
Right.
And so a lot has happened in a year, 6 months. So I always recommend at least a year.
Okay.
Also, big life events. So if you get married, update it. If you get divorced, update it. If someone dies, update it. If someone's born and you want to include them in your will, update it. All of these life events are really important,
Yeah.
especially I would say divorce is very important
Mm-hmm.
because you, a lot of times, 99.9% of the time, when you get a divorce, that person wants their spouse out of their will. And so you don't want to forget that they're still in your will and they're your beneficiary for everything. So I always recommend to my clients, like, if you get a divorce, make sure we update it, and not
Mm-hmm.
just your will, but also your life insurance policies, your bank accounts where they might have been like the transfer on death person, um, anything where you really don't want them to get anything. Unless you have like a very good relationship with your ex. I have seen that before, but most of the time, like, you hate them and you don't want anything to do, you don't want anything to do with them, let alone get your money, no, or your property. Ugh. So I just make sure, like, especially with divorce, just get rid of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. The capacity of life events,
Mhm.
as you mentioned, marriage, divorce, children, because sometimes there's years down the road that those things have happened, and unfortunately, it causes an event to occur that then you remember, oh, I forgot to change that, or I didn't update that, or I need to include that person. And so life events is a good rule of thumb for people to think about, that they need to update not only their estate planning, their beneficiaries, their changes at work, so that it's reflective of those life events in their life currently and not how it used to be.
And also with property, when you buy property too, you want to make sure that's specified in your document, in your will too.
In your will too. Okay. Okay. I think we touched on this, but if there was anything you wanted else to add, is that what is a will and why do you need one? I think we've kind of given some. Is there anything you want to add to that we didn't touch on regarding that?
The only thing I would really add to that is that everyone needs a will, and a lot of times what I get from people is like, well, I don't have anything. Like, why do I need a will? Like, that's not important. And another thing that a lot of people say is people will figure it out. They'll know, like, especially like people always say, like, my kids will figure it out. Like I trust them to not fight about it. No, no, they're gonna fight.
No, they're
Uh,
gonna fight. Yeah.
they're gonna fight. Um, they have a whole section of the court system dedicated to this because people fight. Uh,
Hmm.
so name out exactly, like, really sit down and look at the things in your house. Like this room alone that I'm in right now, I can say, like, oh, I have photo albums, I have books, I have my diplomas, I have my pictures. Like, who do I want? I have a closet over there full of my clothes. Who do I want to get that? Like my computer that I'm like talking on right now. Who do I want to get that? And this is a great time during quarantine to really just take inventory of all of your things and really just write down, who do you want to have them, or if you just want to donate them, or if you want to just sell
Right.
off your property and give the money to a family member or a charity, whatever you want to do, because you have more than what you think that you do. And I
Mhm.
also wouldn't give people more credit than they deserve when it comes to the fighting aspect of it. Um, because people, as we've mentioned before, a lot of this is like sentimental value. And
Mhm.
so I give the example of my grandmother passed away in February, and she left a house that her and my grandfather had like forever. My grandfather has passed away like in the early 90s. And so now my father, and it was his mother that passed. So my father and his two brothers are left behind to figure out what's going to happen to this house. because she didn't have a will, and so they're the ones that get it. And so
Hmm.
two of them just want to sell it, but my father has that sentimental value and doesn't. And so that is a point of contention, and that can cause a lot of headaches. And
Hmm.
it would have just been so much easier if they listened to me and had got my grandmother's will. But that's a story for a different day. And plus, she's not. She was in Virginia. I'm not licensed in Virginia. Had
Gotcha.
I been licensed in Virginia, I would have driven down there and written that will. But it would have been so much easier if my grandma had just written a will saying, like, this is what I want to happen to my property. Instead, here we are months and months later. And it's going to be years, I'm sure. And I
Yeah.
don't know what to do with the house, her car, all of her other stuff. Um,
Hmm.
and so it's just like avoiding those situations and those unnecessary headaches, um, and fights among family members.
That is so very true in terms of the conflicts that potentially could arise. And I think we've kind of touched on the ones that have been like the positive, maybe sentimental, but we're also dealing with human beings, and the fact that sometimes they try to exercise certain emotions
Mm-hmm.
in the result of a probate situation,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes the things are in place of feelings or guilt, and so they will hold on to certain things and want to drag those pieces out because it's a replacement of maybe things that they felt like they didn't do, and so that's where it becomes so very contentious, is that you don't know what the motivation really is, and it can extend that grieving process like
Mm-hmm.
significantly longer than it needs to be. So having a plan helps a lot of family be able to move on quicker than if you don't, and you have to bring this and drag this out for 2, 3. I've even seen probates go as long as 4 or 5 years because there's so many things that need to be adjudicated and decided, and it can be very stressful. It has always resulted in breaking up a family.
Mm-hmm.
Um, whether the family had some broken pieces before, this certainly will exacerbate it, and in many cases, it's permanent in the way that the division in the family is brought to bear.
Mm-hmm. No, that's so true. Like you said, it extends the grieving process way longer than it needs to be extended. And it's just so much better if you just have a plan and it's just written down.
They're written down.
And you make it explicit too. I've had people, estate planning can get kind of juicy. So I've had people like specifically write their children out or write a specific child out. Or say, if you try to fight this will, you're getting nothing.
Yeah.
Uh, and just be very, very clear in your will and no like ambiguous roundabout language. I think the clearer it is, the better. And it's always
Hmm.
great. And I'm not just saying this because I am an attorney, but it's always better to work with an attorney than just like find some random document on the internet or work with like LegalZoom or something. Because excuse me, because when you work with an attorney, you really are working with a human being that's getting to know you and your family dynamics and what your goals are and can tailor it for you, as opposed to just like some random language that's used for everybody. And a lot
Uh-huh.
of times when I've had clients come into my office with wills that they found on the internet, or they had their sister's cousin's friend do it, it's horrible and it's all wrong. It's not a valid will for a variety of reasons. And I have to just start from the beginning, start from scratch. So,
Okay.
and make that investment in yourself and your future, and just invest in the attorney and just get it done the right way the first time.
The first time. Good point. Very good point and very good direction. One quick follow up to something you just said that I think would be good to kind of crush that myth is I hear from a lot of people that in terms of leaving money or assets to their children. They don't want to leave them a bunch of money and then they frivolously go off and use it, and blow it. Can you speak to the specificity that can be put into an estate plan around certain conditions around money, certain actions, or certain milestones that parents can put in, or just other family members can put into their will that make it a requirement for certain things to take place in order for a beneficiary to get certain assets or money? They have to meet certain requirements, or otherwise they potentially could lose that. Can you speak a little bit about that?
So yeah, I see that quite a bit. A lot of times people want to leave money to their children, and they're like, well, I want to leave Johnny $10,000, but Johnny's bad with money and I don't trust him. So in that case, I would really recommend a trust. So a trust is a legal instrument that you would transfer your property over into, and the trust would own the property. And there would be a certain set of guidelines that are followed in order for the beneficiary of that trust to get what's inside the trust. So I left $1,000 in a trust, in the trust of Meredith Hill, and I made you the beneficiary, and I was still the trustee. So a lot of times the person's still the trustee who's still alive. I could make it a requirement that like you have to maintain employment in order to get $100 each year from the trust. Or I may make it a requirement that you have to graduate college in order to get the $1,000 from the trust. Until you reach that point, it's just going to sit into that trust, and you won't be able to access the money that's into it until you reach those milestones. And as it sits in the trust, it also appreciates in value and grows. And that helps build the generational wealth that we like to talk about. So trusts are a really good way of protecting your assets, as well as still having control of them. Even if you're gone, like if say that in my example, I was still the trustee, but if I were to pass away, I could name someone else the trustee, and they would still have to follow those same rules of the trust in order for you to have the money that's in the trust. So it's a good way for you to still have control from the grave of your hard work.
Right. And to your point, it can be as elaborate in terms of actions as the person desires, in terms of whether it's not only a certain type of job, but you can prohibit certain type of activities such as drug use. There's requirements around marriage that you have certain access to it, or you don't, depending on how the marriage goes, and it protects the the family member that you want to protect. So it can be as detailed or as not as you want, but it allows you to have, again, the one word you keep saying, control over exactly what happens to the things that are important to you.
And a lot of times I see this happening with older clients who want to give money to their children, or excuse me, their grandchildren.
Yeah.
And they want it to be done a specific time. And so their grandchildren right now might be like 4 or 5. And they want to give their grandchildren money when they're like 18 or 25 or something like that. But they don't want to give it to their parents right now because they don't trust their kids. I mean,
That's true.
Their children might take the money and like buy a house or something like that, or buy a new car or something like that. Like there's no guarantee. And in this, I don't think you should trust when it's dealing with your money. You should trust nobody. And so what I recommend is to those clients is putting it into a trust, especially if they're really young. Just start it off, and as they grow, as they get older, so the trust will get older and it will appreciate in value, and so there'll be more money sitting there for when little Johnny does reach the age 18, or when he does graduate college or get his first job or something like that. And again, that's another way to help build generational wealth. So you're not just spending the money right here and now on something that's going to depreciate in value. You're putting it in an instrument or a vehicle that's going to appreciate in value and leave a legacy behind for your loved ones.
Very good point. In terms of, the differentiation of why, a trust would be ideal. So we've talked about advanced directives. We talked about in terms of if you have a will, what would happen. And we talked about what in terms if you don't have a will. In terms of the trust, there are a number of different types of trust. What if you could give your expertise and your at least experience, what has been kind of the more common trust that has typically been used in the situations that you've used trust with your clients? Because there's a number of different ones that may not be applicable, but which one have you seen or been the one or two most common types of trust that have been executed for an estate plan with your clients?
So yeah, we could sit here all week and talk about different types of trust because there's a
All
lot
right.
of trust. But the most common that I see and deal with is a revocable trust. And this allows, again, I keep saying the word control. It still allows you to have control and make changes to your trust if you need to. So I can make a trust today, the revocable trust of Meredith Hill, and I leave money for my nephew. And then next week, I might say, you know what, I want to change it. And I also want to leave money for my cousin. And so I can make changes to that. And I can still be the trustee of the trust, or I can name someone else as the trustee of the trust. And being the trustee, it just means that you're managing the trust and you're making sure that my rules are being followed, and everything is going according to my plan. So that's the most common one and that's most of the time what I recommend to people for a revocable trust. A lot of the other trusts, they can get very, very complicated. So I don't want to bore or confuse people today. And so, yeah, so I would recommend starting off talking with your attorney about a revocable trust. And that is often what your attorney would start off recommending you, unless your goals differ.
Okay, revocable trust, perfect. And we talked about this at the beginning in terms of wealth generation, wealth creation, wealth transference. In your estimation, why is it so important from the basics of an estate plan to be able to help you reach those goals of wealth generation and transference? And why, in your opinion, is this often a topic that's overlooked in terms of the overall financial discussion around when families building wealth and being able to transfer it? Estate planning seems to be talked about when you need to talk about it when the event happens, but too often it's not the pre-planning that goes along with it. Why do you think that is, and why do you think it's so critical to wealth generation and transference?
So I feel like a lot of people don't talk about estate planning because they think it just deals with death. And a lot of people don't want to talk about death, even though like we're all gonna die. It's a guarantee. And so just people are just kind of just put off by it.
Right.
But it's something that needs to be addressed. And a lot of times, if you look at it through the lens of, okay, it's not just about me dying, but it's also me leaving a legacy behind for my family, then you can start to really like wrap your head around and your hands around it a little bit more, and really realize that it's not just about death. And right now, like I mentioned before, in our community, we haven't really been doing estate planning because a number of reasons. Like we don't like to talk about death. We haven't really had the knowledge of it. We didn't have access to it. We didn't really have lawyers that we trusted, let alone Black attorneys. There's a number of reasons of why we didn't
Right.
why we didn't do estate planning. And so right now we're in the position where we're playing catch up, and we are now in the position where we can do our estate planning. We can learn about it. Like this um, Facebook Live event is a great way to learn about estate planning and realize the importance of it. Um, so it's important to have an estate plan so that you can leave that legacy behind, so that you have built wealth and you're leaving that wealth behind to your children, and then they're growing it even more, and then they're leaving it behind to their children. That's going to be even more. So we're not starting from scratch each time. Like we
Yep.
stop that notion of starting from scratch each time, because that's how we all did it. Like no. We're doing something new. No, we're going to start building wealth. We're not starting from scratch. We're going to be wealthy. We're going to have generational wealth, and we're going to live in our big mansions like on Dallas.
Like on Dallas. That's a great point. In terms of starting from scratch, I think that it's so critical. And the way that I've described it to clients is that we're all in a race, but imagine that your kids' counterparts have got a half a lap head start.
Mm-hmm.
And because we decided we wanted to start from scratch, they will never catch up, because the lead is so great that what the inheritance and what the transfer of wealth has done is give them a lead. And so even if you are incredibly successful with the next generation, they have no ability to catch up because the lead is so great. That's what it levels the playing field to be able to make decisions for your family and your generations going forward that always aren't about financial, that it can be philanthropic, it can be passions, it can actually being able to pursue things that could change the community and the world. But if you have to always make financial decisions, number one, because you're starting from scratch, that can be the difference maker of how those things continue to repeat themselves. So starting from scratch, you're exactly right. I think that we need to throw that one out the window. We've proven that doesn't necessarily work. So we should try something different.
Yes, that doesn't work. Yes, very true. That's a great analogy, though.
Good. In terms of final thoughts, and regarding estate planning, what are some things that you feel like everyone should know and take some action coming out of this call that would be ideal for them to get started with, if they haven't started with their estate planning, and just your final thoughts around estate planning and where we go from here?
So I would recommend really thinking about the documents I talked about: the will, the financial power of attorney, as well as the advance directive, and making sure that you get them drafted by an attorney. And if you don't know an attorney, you can always reach out to me, and I'd be happy to refer you to one that I know and that I trust, that could handle what you're looking to do. So I would just also recommend, don't be afraid of the process, and necessary. And like we said, we're getting rid of starting from scratch. We're done with that. That's done.
Yeah.
So we are building our generational wealth, and leaving a legacy for our family.
I think those are really good final thoughts. And in terms of what I would add to what you had to say, and I think this is important, is that just in this almost hour discussion, I think you've eliminated a lot of myths, because sometimes we do things out of fear of the unknown. But in your conversation, you've shown how easy it is to get some of these things be done and executed, and it doesn't take a lot of heavy lifting. And once you do it once, if you're just updating, you're just tweaking it. You're just making adjustments. You're not having to start from scratch. And so I think that you've been able to crush a lot of myths and misconceptions around estate planning and how those pieces need to be done. And this is an ongoing conversation, and that we need to continue to have discussions around this because legislation changes
Mhm.
and certain things start to change that we need to be aware of that could play a role in getting estate planning done. So I think you've done a very excellent job of being able to break down some of those myths. And so in terms of actually being able to contact you, I'm going to post up on the screen here your contact information so everyone can see how to get in contact with you,
Mhm.
both your email and your Instagram here. Let me pull it up.
And be sure to mention that you watched this Facebook Live.
Perfect.
You
That
message.
is definitely, yeah, we want to reference that.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we've got some questions in the chat that we will make sure that we are able to pull those questions and we can be able to respond directly to those questions that we may not have been able to get to in terms of the Facebook Live. And so let me pull, I've got you up, so let's share the screen. All right, can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
All right, everyone, that is Meredith's contact information. You have her email and her Instagram. And I can attest, she definitely answers her Instagram. So if you shoot her a DM, she will definitely be able to respond there. So if you have, again, general questions around some of the topics we discussed this evening, or weren't able to get to questions in the chat, certainly reach out to Meredith and she'll be able to answer some of those general questions. Again, she's licensed in Maryland, and so she can speak to specific regulations and specific laws within that state, but she can give you some general information around estate planning and things that you can be able to follow up with someone that's actually licensed in the state of your residence to be able to provide you with some specific information regarding that.
Yeah.
And then I will post up my contact information as well if there's questions that have come up that we want to get to, and for some reason you aren't able to get to Maryland, we can be able to provide that information as well. And so I'm going to post my information also so that you can be able to see that. My email, my YouTube channel, and my Instagram. Certainly, if there's comments about this evening's Facebook Live, we would love to hear them so that we can make changes and improvements and other topics that we want to be able to address on future money conversations. And so with that, I want to say an incredible thank you to Meredith for all of your insight and your willingness to be able to get on Facebook Live and share your expertise, your personal testimonies, and your excitement and desire to try to get as many people with an estate plan as possible. I sincerely appreciate your time, and we certainly will be doing this again because we only scratched the surface of what estate planning is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm so happy you invited me. I feel so excited and honored. And this is my very first Facebook Live too.
Well, mine too. So hopefully we'll be a tad bit better on the next one. So again, I thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening, and we will see you very soon. Have a good night.